What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to do a video explaining Throg, or at least the origin of Throg. The reason why I say doing an origin is because Throg does have appearances in Marvel Comics outside of his origin, obviously, but they never really amount to much, right? I mean, he was part of the Pet Avengers, which was really cool. We could do the Pet Avengers if you guys want. The Pet Avengers was amazing. I loved that line of comics. It was great. But kind of covering these origins here, right, to give you guys perspective on where all this comes from. This originally started in Thor issue number 364 by Walt Simonson. And the origin there is pretty simple. The whole idea behind this is that you had something that was taking place in Asgard that was referred to as the All Thing. Now, the All Thing was a big ceremonial event, and basically it would determine who the ruler of Asgard would be in the absence of Odin, right? Whether he died or went into the Odin sleep or at the time was seemingly out of the picture, whatever the case would be. And the result of this is that Loki, of course, being Loki, wanted to be the one to rule Asgard. And so in order to ensure this happens, what he ended up doing was turning Thor into a frog and then basically banishing him to Earth. And the idea was that as long as Thor was not there during the All Thing process or the All Thing ceremony, that Loki would be chosen by default. And so the way the original story played out was actually really cool. So the whole gist behind this is that Thor as a frog is met by a character named Puddlegulp. And this is super important because this actually bookends into the new origin for Throg. But he's basically met by a character named Puddlegulp and is essentially told, hey, like, there's a bunch of stuff popping off, we're being, attacked by rats and so on and so forth. And Thor, being honorable, basically allied himself with the other frogs and then helped to fight off the rats. But following the defeat of the rats, this led into Thor encountering the Piper, who was not really a relevant villain at all in the history of Marvel Comics, but he did have the ability to charm people and animals based on the music that he played, which led to a conflict with a bunch of alligators. Now, ultimately, Thor was able to overcome that, right? He was able to overcome this battle with these alligators and whatnot, and then essentially made his return back to Asgard, but only after being told that in order to kind of begin the process of turning himself back, he had to be able to wield his own hammer. Now, Thor had largely figured this out. This was already something that he for the most part knew. The issue was trying to find where his hammer was at. And when Puddlegulp told him where his hammer was, Thor, or I guess Throg, ended up lifting it. But it's like the most adorable thing ever because he couldn't lift it with his own hands, right? It wasn't like a mini hammer. It was the size of Mjolnir, right? The regular size of Mjolnir. It was to scale. And so he literally crouches under the handle and pushes it for all his might and is ultimately able to lift it. And when he does, he becomes Throg. And he basically, unlike what you would expect, he turns into like a 6'6" bullfrog, right? Like he's enormous, just like this enormous bullfrog. It's one of the craziest things. But he ends up going back to Asgard. Of course, he defeats Loki the day saved. But the difference is that instead of going forward with him being the guy that would rule Asgard in the instance where Odin was absent, he actually hands it over to Balder the Brave. And so Balder would be the one to rule Asgard in the instance that Odin was unavailable. This is the reason why during J. Michael Straczynski's run on Thor, specifically during the events that went into like Fear itself and all that kind of stuff, that Thor is ultimately banished from Asgard after having killed the serpent, right? Like the brother of Odin that nobody really knew about, because while he was trying to destroy the world, technically he was an Asgardian, and Balder had the authority to do that, right? So that was just kind of a holdover that had gone on for quite some time. Now, the other origin, and the one that you guys are most likely thinking of when you think of Throg, is you're thinking of the character of Simon Walterson. Obviously the character named after Walter Simonson, who created Throg. But the whole gist behind this is he hails from an alternate reality, right? Technically, it's designated Earth 97-161, but the point behind this is that he was a wholly different character. But the way the story is told actually comes by way of both Lockjaw and Throg stumbling across what is basically the Mind Stone, and that's the way the Pet Avengers worked, is they were telepathically linked through the Mind Stone so they could all communicate with each other. Pretty elegant and pretty fun. And the question of how it is that he became that way was raised by Lockjaw, which was really the first indication that because they both touched the Mind Stone, they could read the minds of each other. That Throg basically reveals that he was a kid who was basically a football player. And what ended up happening is that he ended up suffering an injury despite the expectation that he was going to be drafted into the Pro Football League, right into the NFL. And so because of that, he ended up falling in love with a woman, and they were married and they had a great life together. The downside to this is ultimately his wife died. Now, we never find out what it was that killed her. Instead, all we know is that she just died somewhere along the line, right? He's just literally screaming, at her gravestone. But following this, he ended up going and seeking as many mystics, people that had different, supposed abilities to talk to the dead and so on, to find some way if he could talk to her simply just one last time, right? That's all he was really looking for. And the guy dumped all his money into it. Now, most of the people that he came across were frauds, right? People who could supposedly talk to the dead, and it was just reading tarot cards and then interpreting the tarot cards in a way that he might, appreciate basically cold readers is really all they were, until he came across a legitimate mystic, right? Like a woman who could quite literally commune with his wife. And while that was possible, he ended up learning that his wife actually died with an unborn child. And so getting what it was that he wanted, he wasn't able to pay her. And so this basically led to her cursing him as a frog. Now, the whole idea behind this is this bookends into the old Walt Simonson Throg story, where you end up learning that when this guy showed up, that he was basically Puddlegulp. Now, the thing that Marvel doesn't tell us here, Marvel doesn't tell us how we go from this alternate reality depiction of this character to this current depiction as it's shown here. He's simply just there. And the reality is, we can go with it. No one cares. I guess continuity aficionados or people who are huge on continuity will be like, well, actually, I need a definitive explanation. But honestly, things like this are easier if you just accept it, if you just go with it. But he ended up just basically taking time and, living in the sewers of New York until ultimately he ended up coming across Thor, who had been transformed into a frog by Loki. Now, the idea is that Puddlegulp, working alongside Thor, trying to fight against the kingdom of the rats and so on and so forth, basically demonstrated his worthiness, right? The fact that he was a capable warrior, even if he didn't necessarily have the ability to overcome the rats themselves, the desire to do so, the desire to win, was significant because it basically made him into a hero. The reality of this is that Puddlegulp was actually present watching it all unfold when Thor, who again had been turned into a frog, lifted his hammer and turned himself into this 6'6" frog. And so the result of this is that when Tooth Gnasher had actually stepped on the hammer of Thor, that a little piece of the hammer had broken off. Now, why that happened, I mean, the hammer's almost indestructible. Comic book logic, go with it. But with the rats basically circling in on Puddlegulp with the intention of killing him, that he ended up picking up this little shard of the hammer and then it fell and hit the ground. And when that happened, he was turned into Throg. And that's how you get the origin of the modern day version of Throg as he exists in Marvel Comics. So again, we've got a little bit of time here so we can continue on. One of the things that goes on with the character of Throg is that in reality, while he was an alternate reality depiction of the character, Marvel stopped treating him that way. And there were a few things that went into this. One of them was that before the events of this kind of new version of Throg came along, that you did have an instance where basically Thor had returned to Earth, spent some time among, humans, kind of hanging out with people, whatnot, doing what he normally does, and then being told by Puddlegulp and the other frogs that there was a massacre going on in the sewers. That was basically the Mutant Massacre, and that was the way that Marvel had basically crossed Thor over with issue 373 in the Mutant Massacre event itself, which is really a landmark story when it comes to the X-Men, right? It was one of the first major X-Men crossover events to ever happen in the history of Marvel Comics, if not definitively the first, but he just kind of appeared in a few different stories here and there. There wasn't a whole lot going on, and that's one of the things to know about Throg, is that there's not a ton of appearances here. He doesn't have his own solo series. He's very rarely in any team-up books. There's a few that go on, right? Asgardians of the Galaxy, issues 1 through 7, that Kid Loki had assembled a whole bunch of Asgardian misfits, more or less, and that, like, Throg was one of them. There's not a whole lot there, right? And so that's something to expect when you go into the character. If you guys want me to cover anything or any stories that have to do with Throg, is there's not a whole lot to cover here. There's a few tidbits here and there, and they're largely part of existing stories. For example, we recently finished a story called Prey, where Throg returns, which you'll find a link to that down in the description. Really, a link to the Thor playlist down in the description, which will cover everything you want to know about Thor. And Throg appears there, right? But like, he's there for a little bit, and then that's it. That's usually how his character works. He appears for like an issue or two, partway through a story, or maybe he appears, to the conclusion of a story, but doesn't appear until a few issues in, but you don't really see a whole lot of him, right? So that's just something to be aware of. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.